All right. Well, hi, everyone. Welcome and thanks for coming to this webinar about your company's digital footprint, which is the liability that many people aren't even aware that they have. I have a special guest today, Miguel Sampo from Mastercard, their cybersecurity, one of their cybersecurity companies. My name's Aaron Mendes. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Privacy Hawk. I've been a long time enterprise big data analytics and cybersecurity professional. Our company helps individuals and businesses reduce their digital footprint, which reduces their risk of fraud and cybercrimes. Miguel, you want to do a little brief intro of yourself?
Of course. Thanks, Aaron. Good morning, good afternoon to all those on the webinar with us. My name is Miguel Sampo. I'm based out of the West Coast with Mastercard, one of the cyber and intelligence companies. Risk Recon is who I'm with today. I am a senior director with them, and I specialize in helping organizations understand third-party risk and where it exists. I'm going to date myself here. I've been in the cyber world and cyber discipline 25 years. I've covered all walks of cyber at this point, I think, in my career, and still learning new stuff every day, Aaron. So thank you, and a pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah. So for everyone on the webinar, we're going to be doing this kind of like a podcast style conversational. So it's not going to be like a sales pitch or anything like that. In fact, we're not going to talk about our companies at all. This is just all about education, learning about third-party risks and digital footprint and how that can potentially result in compromises in your organization and what to do about it. So we've got some slides that we'll go through and we'll talk about each of the topics, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A, even in the middle of the presentation, and we'll either address them in real time if it makes sense or get to them at the end. And we are recording this so that you can watch it later or share it with anyone that wasn't able to make it. So with that said, move on to the topic. So the first thing that we're going to talk about here is what is a digital footprint, which is also could be known as third-party risk, and why is it important? So I'll start with the way that I define it is that your digital footprint is for your organization is all of the digital traces that are out there on the open web or closed web, dark web, inside your organization, and all the other organizations that your personnel interact with. So you could think about every single vendor, every account that you have with that vendor, every single social media post, every single employee, and all of their personal data and all of their professional data is spread out all over the place. And there's various levels of sensitivity of that data, from financial information to account credentials to top secret intelligence, things that you are private information that you might not want out there. So all of that stuff, if you add that up over let's just say you have hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of employees, could be millions or billions of potential data points. And those potential data points, if falling into the wrong hands, could be used to compromise your organization with a data breach or hacking or ransomware or all kinds of stuff. I'm going to hand it over to Miguel to talk about third-party risk, which is a huge and probably the largest component of the risks that your organization's digital footprint presents.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. And you're spot on, right? When we think of digital footprints, what does that mean, right? You talked a little bit about, everybody that we do business with, and there's two sides to this. There's the consumer side, and then there's the enterprise side, right? And so, we often don't think about that as much, or when we think of, breaches, we think of an organization getting breached, and then when we think about getting hacked, we think that, your private data or your consumer data got hacked. But across the board, when we think of third-party risk, it's also been acronymed TPRM, third-party risk management is what we see. It refers to really the review and the analysis or the control of unforeseen circumstances that can come from an organization's collaboration with their third parties, like your vendors or your suppliers. What does that mean, right? So, when we think about it from an enterprise perspective, third-party risk really refers to what risk am I taking on from doing business with my vendors or my supply chain. In the modern era today, we're connected in so many different ways, right? There's B2B, P2P, there's tunnels, there's VPNs, there's all sorts of different ways that we're leveraging technology, and that we share technology and information, that the days of just protecting my own environment with, the great endpoint protections, firewalls, intrusion detection, having good cloud security, that's perfect. That's still really important. But we also need to start thinking about, the people that we do business with. And if they were to get compromised or something happens on their end, what kind of risk do I have? Or what weak links in the chain does that produce for me? And so when we think of third-party risk, that's exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about what risk do my third parties or my supply chain or my vendors introduce, but can also mean what risk do I have from a public footprint, right? So when somebody sees my organization from the outside, where do I have weak links? And so third party risk across the board expands all the way across anything that's publicly available and that could be, potentially exploited or compromised by these, threat actors or malicious intents.
Cool. Thanks, Miguel.
Yeah, of course.
So we're going to talk about the different ways that your digital footprint can be exploited. So third-party vulnerabilities is one of them. And then the other ones are social engineering attacks, phishing attacks, and network intrusion. So, and we're going to actually talk about each one of these exploitations, starting with third-party vulnerabilities, which is Miguel's expertise. So Miguel, can you talk about a little bit like how would someone exploit third-party vulnerabilities and how would that hurt my organization?
Yeah, great question, Aaron. So we're going to do a little 101 here, right? So when we think about the world of compromises and exploitations, the first thing that comes to mind for me is something like CVE, Common Vulnerability Exploits, or organizations like MITRE. We all know that today in the wild, there are over 97,000 known exploits or vulnerabilities that exist out there. Do all 97,000 vulnerabilities necessarily pertain to me or affect me necessarily or my systems or my organization? The answer is probably not. But having said that, one of the most important pieces to any cybersecurity program is making sure that your systems are properly hygiened, or that you're running a good hygiene program. And what I mean by that is that as a practitioner or as a program owner or as an organizational owner, we got to make sure that the systems that we run and expose to the internet are properly patched so that they can't be compromised or that vulnerabilities can't be exploited, leaving a backdoor open for a bad guy or a hacker to get in. And so when we think about the risk that are posed by our vendors, quite simply what we're saying is that we today in the third party world or in the arena that we play in, typically when we onboard a new vendor, and this is across the board, right? I don't want to speak for one specific organization or whatnot, but typically, organizations will use some kind of a questionnaire or an onboarding process that asks the vendor or that supply chain that you're working with, do you have certain security practices in place? Are you patching your systems regularly? Do you have, multi-factor authentication, et cetera? There's a series of questions that come up. And so, and most of the time, organizations, your vendors, and people that you're doing business with are going to respond to the best of their knowledge, and they're going to tell you that yes, they do. And so where the notion of trust but verify comes in, or what we're looking at, is that oftentimes, the answer to the questionnaire or the onboarding process may be yes, and we trust that vendor or supply chain is doing the right things, but we really need to verify, because if we're not verifying those things, then that's where we get into trouble. And that's really where the risk is posed, is that if we don't have a way to continuously monitor or actually be able to look at, are our vendors indeed doing that? Are they using good security practices and patching their systems and making sure that vulnerabilities are mitigated and aren't exploitable to some degree? That's what we need to look at. And that's really when we talk about exploiting third-party vulnerabilities, what we're looking at, Aaron, is that organizations need to ensure that the people that they're doing business with are taking the right steps, the right safeguards, and are invoking the right hygiene and security measures to make sure that they're mitigating that risk or the potential for vulnerabilities to be exploited.
Yeah, thanks. And I want to add that a lot of these organizations might not even be aware of some security vulnerabilities that they have. They might be doing all the best practices, but they miss stuff because there's thousands of potential vulnerabilities, and so it's not necessarily that they were being dishonest. They just didn't know, and so there's tools out there to help you assess those vendors. Miguel, you want to talk about some of the stories, some of these some of these major data breaches that we've heard about in the past, like Equifax and Target and SolarWinds, that were actually not initially caused by those organizations themselves. It was actually a vendor was compromised first, and then they were able to use what they got from compromising that vendor to go hack Target and Equifax.
Yeah, absolutely, Aaron. So a couple things, right? So number one, let me throw some stats out there. So according to Pokemon, in 2022, what we saw was that of the publicized breaches that we saw, over 60% of them were in relation or in regards to a third party cause or a third party vendor that emanated from, meaning that the direct breach effect is not as prevalent as it was 5-7 years ago. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but majority of the breaches that we saw or that organizations suffered were as a direct result of a third party. And so to your point, you brought up a couple, right? The list is pretty long, especially in 2020 when we saw SolarWinds, right? It didn't affect one company, but we're talking about thousands of organizations as a result of of an exploitation there, where typically we see a direct compromise of an organization. It's a one-to-one relationship. You mentioned Target. I think that's a pretty well-known one, and not meaning to add salt to the wound for Target here, right? But that one's about 7-8 years old there, when Target was compromised, and it wasn't a direct it wasn't a direct compromise of their systems, but rather a direct compromise of a vendor that they were working with, an HVAC vendor, as a matter of fact, where a threat actor was able to gain access to the vendor. And then once they were on the vendor's network, they were able to see that this vendor had connectivity to their customer base. One of them was Target, and they made it onto the network and started to move laterally through the network and park themselves on a network. And that's an example of a network intrusion to some degree, right? When we look at it, and they were able to scrape credit card transactions. And to date, I believe that has been the largest or the most expensive breach of the time. That was, I believe, $18.5 million. If memory serves me right, I'm actually looking at my notes here, but I do know that it was over 41 million consumers that were affected as regards to that exploitation there of a third party, Aaron. And the list goes on, right? There's Anthem that took place not that long ago. You mentioned Experian, Equifax. There was Quest not that long ago. I mean, I don't think we go a week without seeing some kind of compromise that are out there. And we start to look at the details, we can see that a lot of this is not a direct one-to-one relation, but rather, hey, I'm doing business with somebody, they've been exploited. Now, what consequences do I have, or what liabilities are now posed to me from that perspective? So definitely scary times that we live in, Aaron, for sure. No doubt about that.
Yeah. So if someone's organization has a whole bunch of different SaaS subscriptions where every employee has their own login, if that SaaS subscription gets hacked and they can get access to the login credentials, could they use that to maybe make the assumption that some of these employees are probably reusing the same password for their own corporate credentials, and then they could log into that employee's accounts in their own organization?
Remember, I'm one of the good guys, Aaron, so I'm not going to incriminate myself here, right? So, but all kidding aside, I mean, listen, I've been a practitioner for a long time. There's all sorts of different tactics that they can use. I mean, how oftentimes somebody's trying to get a hold of somebody in an organization, and we look at the domain name and maybe look at the email pattern. Is it first name dot last name at domain.com or whatever that may be? Absolutely, Aaron. Of course, they're looking at all sorts of patterns and behaviors. The scary part is that in the world that we live in today, there are so many tools that bad guys can use to leverage this type of pattern or behaviors or tactics to go and do the bad stuff, right? I mean, we have AI. You can actually leverage chat GPT for all I know and go ask it for instructions on how to devise a compromise, right? I mean, there's all sorts of different tactics and techniques that the bad guys are using. And truth be told, look, I mean, I don't think that the good guys are ever going to be ahead of the bad guys. We're always going to be a step behind. But if we're invoking all the right things and trying to do all the preventative stuff and all the right things ahead of time, it'll help mitigate when these situations happen. And like I tell organizations that I work with on a regular basis, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And so, it's absolutely detrimental that we invoke, security and layers, like, that I don't want to sound cliche, but that we invoke all the right practices to make sure that we're, following good security protocols and that we've got strong security programs. And not just on the enterprise side. I mean, you can talk more to the consumer side, right? There's things that we can do as consumers that we should protect ourselves, right? Don't click on every email, as an example. Make sure you know where the email's coming from. But I'll be quiet and I'll hand it back over to you because I think that's an area that you can talk, with more expertise around things like that as well.
Yeah, I mean, consumers also have a digital footprint, and it's the vast majority of fraud and scams come from information about us as individuals that hackers and scammers are able to use to exploit us. Like, for example, you can go to a data broker website and canvass a family and find out who's related to who, can identify grandparents, grandchildren. You can call the grandparent pretending to be the grandchild, and maybe you pretend that it's an emergency and that you need $10,000, and then the grandparent wires it to the scammer, and then that money's gone. We call that the grandparent scam. It's actually it's so common that there's a section on the FTC's website all about it. Okay, so the next topic that we're going to talk about with your organization's digital footprint is social engineering and phishing attacks. So, like I was talking about, all of these SaaS subscriptions that we have, which is just one example of a lot of places where our employees have all kinds of personal data. And they're creating login credentials, they're putting in company credit cards, they're then maybe having to create a profile with that SaaS provider. Maybe they have to put in an EIN number. Depending on which vendor you're using, they can have a ton of sensitive information about your employees. And let's say maybe you have hundreds or thousands of seats with some of these different vendors. And so each employee is creating their own digital footprint within that vendor. If that vendor gets hacked, all of that account information gets leaked. And then the hackers can go through that and look for vulnerabilities. A lot of the things that they can learn from that information can be used to try to trick people in your organization into either accidentally giving credentials or access to systems that they shouldn't have access to. And so, and if you do the math, just back of the envelope, like let's say you have 1,000 employees and each employee has, 50 accounts that they interact with throughout their day to do their job, that's 50,000 different potential vulnerabilities. So it's a big problem. So another topic that we'll talk about that Miguel had already talked about is network intrusion. So there's ways that they can get into your network by stealing credentials from third-party vendors, like I was mentioning before, but also like Miguel was talking about, is like the Target's HVAC vendor was able to use that to get into Target's network. And so you need to be thinking about everyone that interacts with your company. What are potential ways that they have access that somebody else could exploit? They're approved to have that access, but somebody else might be able to hack into them and then through them get into your network. So it's just something to be aware of. Miguel, anything you want to add about that?
Yeah, and forgive me, Aaron, I'm going to take a step back for a second. I'm going to talk about social engineering that you were talking about for a second. So, and a lot of times it's a mistake. There's campaigns that organizations can run. You can educate your user base on, how to properly, I don't want to say how to use email appropriately, but we can't just click on everything, right? We have to understand where email is coming from, and have good, good practice around email, so that our credentials aren't compromised, so that we're not clicking and, letting malware into the environment. And that's kind of from a phishing perspective. That's probably one of the biggest things, right? Is that they'll click on a link, and that link will execute some kind of a malware or some kind of an executable that'll run on your system, and then unbeknownst to the user, it'll propagate through the network, and then then we're subject through email, right? It's not just phishing, but there's also there's phishing. There's also sorts of other methods that go on there. Social engineering. I mean, we don't think about it, but we go on on all these social media sites, and we have our information out there. A bad guy could then track us down, get that information, find out where we work, use that as an opportunity, as an area to go and then compromise us at our place of work and organization. The bad guys are really tricky, Aaron. I mean, they're doing all sorts of steps and trying to figure out how they can steal this data. There's the dark web, right? Information's out on the dark web. And so I just wanted to go back and kind of talk a little bit about, from a spoofing email perspective, I will share one use case, or one kind of evidentiary piece of information here. You can go to threatpost.com, and you can search on the Anthem breach of 2015 and see exactly how email was leveraged there, and how that led to over 18,000 members of Anthem that had their information compromised, and kind of what that led to. And so again, this is not meant to be a scary session or kind of to scare people, but the reality is that it's out there, right? We want to understand, how do we use email effectively, and how do the bad guys leverage email to go and compromise and get information, and how they're leveraging social media? It's out there, right? And so anyways, thanks for going back to that, Aaron, and going back to the network intrusion piece. You're right. I talked about Target a second ago, and there's so many different elements to the network component of compromises, right? From a third party risk perspective, or when we think about publicly available data, we think about all these websites that we visit. When we think about the enterprise or the commercial world of the house, we do business with X amount of vendors, thousands of vendors, hundreds of vendors, whatever that may be, and they all have a public presence. Could be web email, could be their web server, could be their order form, or whatever that may be. It could be the B2B site, where we have our information as an organization that we work with, and everything's in the cloud, everything's in the web, everything's public now. And so what I'll share with you is that if organizations aren't doing a good job of making sure that the ports and protocols that can be exploited, going back to the vulnerability conversation, if we're not doing a good job of making sure that those ports are secured, or that we got the right level of encryption or the right level of security, if those ports were to get compromised, does that leave a door open for the bad guys? And so to your point around the Target thing, that's exactly what happened, right? There was a threat actor that was scanning the internet, and he happened to stumble across this big HVAC company. It wasn't a mom and pop shop, it was a big one. Ran a threat, a port scan, and found an open port. Went and kind of dug deeper, kept kicking the doors down, and made their way onto the network. Once they were onto the network, they had an open access, wide open door into one of their vendor accounts, which was Target. And then they found the Target network and exploited that. But that again, that was a great example of a network intrusion, right? They infiltrated through a particular port. Did we know what the bad guys do? Did their magic, work through their, I don't know if I call it magic, maybe their voodoo, did their thing and work through there, and then we're able to do that. And that is similar to what happens when we saw like the SolarWinds attack here not that long ago, right? Where it's exploited, a malware then runs, and that malware leaves a certain port open or a certain back door open for the bad guys to come in and have wide open access to, to our domains and to our kingdom. And so, yeah, network intrusion unfortunately is a big piece. There are steps that we can do to protect ourselves, being able to understand and monitor, what ports, we can do port scans, we can do vulnerability scans, we can do all sorts of different tools that are out there to be able to do that. But if we're not doing them continuously, and we don't know how to read them, or if we're not holding our vendors accountable to making sure that they're doing on a regular practice, we're going to run into problems there. And that's exactly what we're seeing.
Yeah, these guys can be sneaky too. Let's say there's a SaaS provider that has tens of thousands of businesses as their customers, and they get hacked. The hacker doesn't have to do anything right away to make it known that they're in there. But what they could do is put a piece of malware that gets downloaded onto computers when they log in when their customers log in, and now they're on the computers of all their customers without anybody knowing, and then they can use that to identify organizations that they exploit, because now they're on through one vendor that has tens of thousands of businesses and maybe hundreds of thousands of seats. It's not that hard from a web browser to get something downloaded onto someone's computer that they just missed, they just didn't notice, because you're clicking around doing stuff. And yeah, that's kind of similar to what happened with SolarWinds, where yeah, they distributed malware because SolarWinds had very deep access into the systems of their customers by nature of what they do. And that was a really bad one. Like you said, thousands of companies got nailed on that one.
Yeah, the Orion platform, right? That opened the back door, which they can then impersonate the users and the accounts at the victim organizations, right? That was kind of the one big one. And then I'm going to date myself. I'll take you a step back. I mean, do you remember the days of RDP, remote desktop protocol, right? I mean, where we could contact, our help desk, and our help desk wasn't necessarily on-prem. They were overseas somewhere, but we would leave a wide open door, and then they could start to remote control, and all of a sudden you see the guy controlling your mouse. I mean, that's just one example, right? But the example of, if we didn't lock down RDP, or we left RDP wide open, anybody could get on our machines. I mean, good old thank you Windows, right? But I mean, that RDP is one that I remember back from my day, back in the 2010 days, early 2000s, right? We were looking at, and we had to make sure that RDP was closed down. And at some point, they actually started just eliminating RDP and not leaving it open for organizations to be able to do things like that, because it was just too much of a liability. Anyway, sorry, Aaron, I didn't mean to take us backwards there, but
no, that's
something to think about.
Those are all very interesting stories. All right, so we'll briefly talk about the consequences. I suspect most people on this call know what the consequences are, but basically, company, if there is a security breach, there's financial losses, reputational damage, regulatory consequences, operational disruption. Miguel, I think you mentioned Target was the most expensive. Like, do you have some stories about third-party vendor caused breaches where the end victim, which was not maybe the vendor, but some of the vendor's customers, like how much, what were the consequences to those organizations like Equifax or some of these other examples?
So they're all in the millions, right? And they've gone up, and they continue to go up every year. From a financial perspective, kind of taking them right off the list here in order. Number one, the average cost, according to the Pokemon Institute, and I think I said Pokemon earlier. I think I was thinking of my kids or something, but it was Pokemon.
I noticed that. That was funny.
I think thanks for not saying anything, for making me look like a dum-dum.
Well, you
No,
had me
Pokemon.
questioning it, because I was like, I thought it was. Wait, is it Pokemon?
No, Pokemon. I'll go back and do a retraction. Pokemon, not Pokemon. I was in my kids' world here. I don't know. I'm coming off of COVID, so forgive me, right? I unfortunately I ended up with this nasty virus, different kind of virus, but I ended up with a virus here. But anyways, financial losses, according to the Pokemon Institute, the average cost of a breach is around $4.5 million now. And so I just got back from RSA earlier this year, and they were talking about breaches, right? One of the biggest security conferences up in San Francisco. We talk about this all the time, and I mean, it goes up every year. I also spent some time with Dell SecureWorks and one of my previous roles, and then most recently with FireEye, where we did incident responses, incident retainers, and worked with the Mandiant team, right? And we talked about, and this is what I did day in, day out. Is help organizations when they were breached. And so financial loss is definitely the one that hits the pocketbook. But the other one that hits the pocketbook that is not necessarily listed here, but it's brand damage, right? You have reputational damage, but once you suffer that, what's the cost of that? There's a financial impact to not only the reputational damage, but the brand damage, right? What's that brand damage going to cost? And so, we can see that these things get into the millions of dollars. But yeah, the Target one, I mean, that was obviously, like I said, 7-8 years ago. To date, that was a pretty large one. And then we've got the Anthem one, which was in the millions, and we see more recently, right? There were scripts here locally in San Diego not that long ago, that we saw that also suffered. So we see these across the board. I think the largest one that I ever saw, I think it was the state of, and don't quote me on this one. I don't want to quote it, but it was one of the states in the South, about 7-8 years ago, that had one of the largest sled breaches, and that was over $100 million one, on that one. And the irony of that one was that we think about cyber insurance. There's an element of due diligence, and if we don't do our due diligence, insurance doesn't have to pay out, right? And those are things to think about. So they are absolutely costly. But I guess the number I'll leave you with, or the one that's more specific, is that the average cost of a breach today in 2023 is north of $4 million right now, just to start. So something to think about. That's not pocket change there.
Yeah, and there's some numbers out there like per record too. I think it's like hundreds of dollars per record that's lost or something like that.
Well,
Like
that's
I
the
got
damage
a hundred
recently.
dollars. Yeah, I got $100 from Scripps because they leaked my information. It's not worth it. I would rather have that my medical information not leaked. But they gave $100 to every single one of their patients because that was a ransomware attack, and that was bad. They were shut down for like over a month. The doctors couldn't see patients because the systems were locked down. So that's that operational disruption. Like how much does if you get attacked by ransomware and they shut your business down, that's massive revenue loss.
I can tell you that the most expensive one ever was Epsilon, and I believe that was $4 billion.
Wow.
That was the largest one, and that was the one. There was emails that included, I believe, Best Buy, J.P. Morgan Chase, Target was there, and so that was a really expensive one for sure. But we talk about the financial piece, and and we're talking about publicly available, or public companies. There's other ones that are private that don't have to report them, that we never know about. We don't know what those cost, right? There are other organizations out there that are not publicly traded that are also worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And when they get compromised, we'll never hear about them, because there's
Yeah.
no mandate to do that, right? And so that kind of, brings us right into, not to kind of hijack your session here, but regulatory consequences. There are legal liabilities as well in some of these cases, right? Where you mentioned, you got $100 check, and how many of us have received, I'm going to raise my hand, we received a letter from some identity company or some credit company giving us free access to a credit portal to monitor our credit on the consumer side, to make sure that nobody's opening accounts because our email address and our private information was, our personal identifiable information was compromised or leaked through one of these organizations' hacks, right? Or data breaches. And so there are other components that we have to think about when we look at that as well, Aaron. So the first two hit the pocketbook pretty strong, and then we get into some of the legal stuff, regulatory compliances, and we can talk about HIPAA, Sarbanes-Oxley. We can talk about some of the other kind of GRC pieces that are out there. But let me hand it back over to you so you can bring us kind of back in order here. But yeah, 4 billion Epsilon. I mean, that's not a
Yeah.
cheap one. That was an expensive one.
Okay, cool. So now that we have beat the problem to death, we're going to talk about what you can actually do about it. So there's a lot of things that you can do. At the end of the day, at a high level, it's reducing your organization's digital footprint, which is effectively reducing third-party risk. And so there's a lot of proactive things that you can do, and there's a lot of tools out there that can automate identifying a lot of these third-party risks. And so we're going to go over what some of those are. So here's kind of the strategies for reducing your digital footprint. So one of the things that our company can help with is helping identify just the sheer scale and size of your organization's digital footprint, and then helping remove unnecessary accounts. So your organization, maybe it's been around 10 years, 20 years, maybe it has thousands of employees. How many SaaS subscriptions or things have all these thousands of employees signed up for over the years, put in a credit card for $50 a month or $10 a month, and either stopped using it or still have an account but don't use it? So now there's various levels of sensitive information that are just out there unnecessarily. And so what you want to do is regularly audit all these different accounts that your employees have set up, and have a lot of those accounts that aren't being used anymore, get them deleted. Deleting those accounts means that if that organization gets compromised and maybe they have thousands or tens of thousands of customers, you're not in the database that got hacked, and so you're less likely to have credentials leaked or other sensitive information that could be used for phishing and social engineering attacks and things like that. The second strategy is managing third-party vendor risk, which is Miguel's expertise. So I'm going to hand it over to Miguel to talk about, what can people do to identify what these risks are, and then what would they do about it?
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. I appreciate that. So, unfortunately, there's no unicorn out there. There isn't one solution that I would say this solution will do everything for you and your third-party risk goes away. No such thing. And anybody that tells you so is lying to you. It's just what's not there yet. And so, this definitely requires a security and layers approach. And so there's different elements, right, or different pieces when we look at third parties, right? One is let's understand what our vendors programs look like, and one of the methods that organizations use today is when they do an onboarding process, there's questionnaires. There's companies that can create questionnaires. There's about 27 different frameworks that exist out there. There's ISO 27001, NIST, SIG, NERC. I mean, I can go on and name several of these frameworks that are out there that help us kind of build questionnaires or ask the right questions around how strong is a security program look like, and what's the hygiene that they invoke and how do they do that. So questionnaires is definitely one element of it. Problem with the questionnaire though is that it's a process that's done once a year. It's not done daily or weekly, and so if we do it in January and we don't do it again until the next January, what happens in those next 12 months? And so that's where
There's
then
probably also, sorry, just to add, there's probably also a lot of companies that won't do that. Like if I go to subscribe to like a CRM company, and I'm one of like 100,000 customers, like, are they going to answer a questionnaire for me for $50 a month?
probably not. Probably not, right? Or the other question is, are they going to want to answer a 1,500 question questionnaire, right? Some of these questionnaires have
Yeah.
1,500 questions on it, and so you're like, and I'll give you a scarier one. Who's answering the questionnaire? Is it the actual security practitioner? Nothing against an account vendor management team, but they're not security professionals. And so is it just check the box and, they're just doing it to kind of get through the process? So questionnaires and kind of looking at that is definitely still a strategy. It's not going to go away anytime soon, but we still need to look at those. And to augment that, going back to the security and layers piece, is the need for a continuous monitoring tool. That's where Risk Recon comes in, right? We are a continuous monitoring platform where we can monitor continuously your vendor portfolio, and we can come back and give you information, a full dissertation on what your vendor's hygiene looks like based on their publicly available machines, right? I can't do anything behind the vendor's firewall, but anything that's publicly available, I can tell you, hey, you work with vendor A, B, and C, and based on vendor A, B, and C, here's a dissertation of what we found. Here's their grade. We use an A, B, C, D, F grading scale, or 0 through 10, and this vendor is an A, or this vendor is a C, and here's why they're a C, and this might merit for you to go and have some conversations with that vendor around how do they strengthen that security posture that we're finding. And so a continuous monitoring platform, excuse
What
me,
are some
and then
examples of things that come up from that monitoring? Can you dive into that a little bit? Like, because it's a
yeah,
little bit ambiguous. Like, what do
no,
you
no,
look
great.
at? Like, give me some examples.
So I'm not going to give you the PhD of it, right? But I will tell you that today, there's a couple organizations out there that provide some guidance around things that we should be looking at. So Risk Recon looks at several different categories when we create a profile. The most important one that we're looking at is we're looking at an organization's ability to patch their system, software patching. We know that when systems aren't patched, that is a big red flag, or a big open door for the bad guys to go and exploit. So we're looking at an organization's software patching. Are they running end of life software? Are they running software that can be completely exploitable? Because there's no new patches, and so there's a lot of known vulnerabilities, and a bad guy could figure out how to exploit a certain version of that. Are they running certain levels of web encryption? Do they have mail servers or web servers that are out there that aren't running encryption, that data could be compromised? So we're looking at software patching, we're looking at the application security, we're looking at encryption, we're looking at email security of organizations, we're even looking at the past breach history of an organization. And the reason why I bring that up is that's a non-technical check, Aaron, but we also know that once an organization's been breached, the likelihood of them being attacked again is exponentially higher as well. And so we're looking at an organization's ability to, to respond, and how do they respond when there is a compromise, right? Do they have an incident plan in place, or incident response plan in place to be able to look at those? So going back to your question, we look at multiple elements, right? We're looking at 1,000 different sources of intel, threat intel, to be able to kind of ascertain what the posture of that organization is, and then comprise that into an assessment or a scan that's done every 7 days, right? So we go out and we're scanning every 7 days. You have the ability to request a scan on a daily basis if you want, but by default we do every 7 days, because that's typically the change management window of most organizations. Yeah, but we're looking at nine major categories across the board, 41 different criteria, and about 1,000 different intel sources that we're pulling to be able to do that. So anywhere from domain registrar to global net blocks, et cetera. That's the data that we're looking at, Aaron.
Yeah, I remember looking at it with you, and it was shocking how many endpoints a big organization has. Like, whoever provides the internet at your office or at your house, these are huge multi-billion-dollar organizations, and they might have a bunch of subsidiaries, and then they have 30 different services, and each one of those services has its own website. One's part of it's behind a login, part of it's forward facing, and they might have 5 different endpoints for their API on each one of those websites, and they're using different kinds of technologies. Some of them are third-party libraries that they're loading in, and any single one of those, anything single one of those links in the chain that's not patched could be compromised. And once you get in, then you get full access to everything else. And so, we were looking at some of these big organizations, and nobody was perfectly clean. I mean, there was definitely some people that had like a bad grade and some people that had a good grade. But even the people that had a good grade, when we were going through the list of things that you guys found, there were definitely, things that were vulnerable. And so, it's a game of whack-a-mole, but it's better to get a handle on it than to not do anything.
It's definitely a work in progress, right? You're absolutely spot on, Aaron. I'll use Microsoft for in a quick example here. I mean, you ever think about how many systems Microsoft has on the internet?
I
I'm not
mean,
just talking
how
about
many
behind their network.
subsidiaries? Yeah, how many brands do they have?
Exactly.
It's crazy.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's huge, right? I mean, Microsoft is over a couple 100,000 systems on the internet, just with Microsoft. I mean, they're a global organization, right? But those are the things we need to think about, right? And we need to think about who we do business with. But going back to securing the footprint, those are probably the 3 big ones that I would give you: is understanding how to leverage security questionnaires, having a continuous monitoring platform, and then being able to have an incident response plan or a mitigation plan in the event that something takes place. And how do we deal with that? Who do we call first, and where do we go from there as well?
Yep. Cool. So yeah, I mean, my opinion, based on what I've learned from you, is that the questionnaire is great, but the automation is really much, like, orders of magnitude more powerful and thorough, because a robot can go find a bunch of stuff that an organization doesn't even know they have.
Yeah, absolutely. You're spot on.
Yeah. So other strategies for reducing your digital footprint, not your carbon footprint, as somebody asked in the Q&A, is data sharing, having very stringent data sharing and data storage policies at your organization and for your vendors. Understand the practices of your vendors. Just training your employees, telling them to give the least amount of information to vendors as possible. Don't reuse passwords across all your different SaaS providers, because if one of them gets hacked, then they can hack into all your other vendors. And so yeah, just helping employees be aware of that
Aaron,
stuff.
let me jump into number 4 here for a second for us. So I can tell you that locally, and I don't want to make a commercial for anybody here, but locally in San Diego, there's an organization, a nonprofit organization called the Cyber Center of Excellence. CEO, I believe is Lisa Easterly, that's out there, but they run, and she works with local municipalities, City of San Diego, City of Vista, City of Carlsbad. They're invoking things like cyber awareness, and they're running programs to help organizations or constituents of those municipalities awareness around cyber and kind of how, how to properly and how to use cyber, et cetera. And it's not just for large organizations; it could be for small organizations as well, right? We all have a responsibility across the board to be able to understand how to use this effectively. And so you talk about employee training, there's a lot of great campaigns that are offered through that. So for those on the line today, I would definitely check with your local municipalities and check with cyber centers and resources in your area. You can always reach out to Aaron and I as well. We can always kind of point you in the direction. We have a pretty big network, but employee training and user privacy settings, I think, is a big one. And that's probably one of the most important ones is let's become, not just on the consumer side, but in the enterprise side, let's become savvy users, understand some of the what are some of the traps that are being set out there, and how to do that. The FBI locally, to your local FBI division, cyber division, also has campaigns and information that you can use and keep yourself abreast of what's going on and what kind of scams that we're seeing, et cetera, and what exploitations are going on. But anyways, Aaron, I'm sorry, I'll hand it back to you.
Sure. We're about to jump into Q&A. So in conclusion, reducing your organization's digital footprint and third-party risk significantly reduces your risk of having a system compromised that can be very costly. And it's an ongoing thing. It's like kind of like whack-a-mole, but you need to stay on top of it. And leveraging technology that can help with this stuff is definitely very beneficial compared to trying to manually keep track of all of it. So yeah, we'll move on to questions now. So there's a few questions in here, Miguel. The first one is: would a mid-sized company benefit from vendor monitoring if they have under 500 vendors? Actually, let me jump in real quick and present a problem that I didn't mention before, which is that how do you know it's only 500 vendors? The vendors that you might be able to find in your accounting books might only be a fraction of the vendors of stuff that your organization has signed up for that you don't even know about. Because some of this stuff is free. And so it's not even going to be on your books, but your employees have signed up for stuff. But let's say that it is under 500 vendors. Miguel, you want to talk to that?
Yeah, so absolutely. And so I love the question that you pose. How do you know it's only 500 vendors, right? But what I will tell you is that there's no organization too small or too big for us. And so, excuse me, the other component is that a lot of times organizations think it's only my IT vendors. No, it's all your vendors. It could be based on line of spend, line of business, et cetera, that we look at that. But to answer that question more specifically, there is no minimum criteria. It's a matter of understanding, and where organizations start to look at is vendor categorization or vendor classification, understand the importance of vendors. What I will tell you is that not all vendors are created equal. We want to look at, kind of where, what are the most critical vendors that are important to the organization, and kind of look at them from that perspective. But, we can help you with that type of an exercise, right? Or that kind of a scoping, is being able to look at, excuse me, what that is, and take it to the next step.
Yeah, I'll also add that it depends on the types of sensitive information that you have in your systems and how important it is for those to not get compromised. But even if you only have 50 vendors, that's 50 attack vectors, and it's less expensive to track fewer vendors. So it's not like this. If you're a smaller organization, it's not like it's this multi-million-dollar cost to monitor a handful of those vendors. Next question is from Christian. He said, how about self-hosted SSO or SSI? Wouldn't that solve this?
I'm sorry, I didn't see that question. Can you repeat it?
It says, how about self-hosted single sign-on or SSI? Wouldn't that solve this?
So it depends, right? I can't answer that specifically right off so that definitely single sign-on is one other method that we can use there, Aaron, but that's just one particular server, right? I mean, we're not talking about one server. We're talking about hundreds of servers that an organization may have. Could be mail servers, could be, it just depends. And so it's hard for me to be able to say that. Um, you as a user for that particular vendor may only log on to one, but that organization themselves could have hundreds of servers. And if the other servers don't have that multi-factor authentication or single sign-on capability on there, are they still exploitable? And then could they move into the network and compromise other parts of the network? So just something to think about from that perspective.
Yeah, also the login credentials is only a small fraction of the sensitive information that you have to give to a vendor. So let's say you're using Okta for single sign-on, that might be protecting the login credentials, but in order to use some CRM system or some accounting system, you have to input a whole bunch of information that's hosted by that third-party vendor, and your single sign-on solution can't protect from that. And so what we're talking about here is the entire contents of all the information and access that your vendors have beyond just login credentials. But single sign-on definitely does help. It does help reduce the amount of login credentials that you have floating out there, but it doesn't totally solve the problem.
It doesn't solve the problem of
Christian,
vulnerabilities.
yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say it doesn't solve the problem of vulnerabilities, right? It definitely helps the login situation or the individual logins, but it still doesn't solve the other practical pieces that we look at. If an organization is taking the right steps and patching the right systems, et cetera. So you're absolutely spot on that one as well, Aaron.
Sure. But then there was another question: are these campaigns available in Europe?
So I can, for risk recon specifically, we definitely have campaigns that are global. We are a global organization, and so I don't know specifically of all the regulations that are going on, but I know that GDPR and things of that nature, there's all sorts of stuff going on in EMEA, because I hear it from my other colleagues that are working globally and stuff. So yes, there are campaigns available globally.
Cool. So Robert asked, have you guys considered doing authenticated scanning?
Great question. Love it. So a couple of things. So we are owned by Mastercard, and we're part of the Cyber and Intelligence Group. And what I'll share with is that I invite you to reach out to us, and happy to do a roadmap and kind of share with you what we've got coming down the road. A lot of new exciting things that are taking place. We just recently acquired Bath and Bay Networks, and we're integrating DDoS and network scanning pieces into our product. We got systemic risk assessment coming, and so lots of new things coming. We are part of the Mastercard family, as you can imagine. Mastercard takes digital payments very seriously, and with the utmost scrutiny around security. And so lots of great things coming. Stay tuned, and if you're interested, by all means, please reach out. And happy to do a one-on-one session or point you to the right person.
Cool. Thanks, Miguel. So we have a question about consumers. How can consumers best identify personal data exposure? And once that initial exposure is resolved, how can the consumer sustain that protection seamlessly? So this is what Privacy Hawk does for our consumer product. And so what we realize is that you have to do it with technology. Just the same way an individual can't identify all the vulnerabilities in an organization, it's way too impractical and time consuming for an individual to go try to figure out where all their personal data is. And especially there's all these places and data brokers that they've never heard of and wouldn't know to look for. So Privacy Hawk has a service that does the scan for you and identifies those vulnerabilities, and then enables you to delete yourself from corporate and data broker databases with the touch of a button. Ongoing protection is a big component of what we do. We rescan regularly to find new vulnerabilities because these data brokers, they get your information again, or new data brokers are popping up. And also, we're the only company that has both the first party data and third party protection. So first party is all the stuff you've signed up for over the years, which on average for our users, like over 300 different accounts that we find, most of which they don't use anymore. So you can go delete a bunch of those, but then you sign up for 20 more things over the next 2 months, and maybe you don't use 15 of them. So we have ongoing monitoring. But yeah, it really comes down to using technology to identify these vulnerabilities and automatically remove them. So we're coming up against time. So let's, Robert was talking about, there's a section of EASM, TPRM companies that are getting into DAST-ish and SCA-ish functions to mitigate frequency of full-on pen tests. So have your millions of vendors scores, but Own Enterprise performing a deeper scan. Tenable is trying, but their discovery sucks. And then this question is kind of related to that: is can you use this information to address gaps in your own security, or would the vendor have to fix the issues on their side? So that's kind of I think all a similar question, which is how can this this type of technology that you guys have be used to protect your own security and identify your own issues?
Yeah, I love it. So we have an element called Own Enterprise where you're able to scan your own organization, Aaron. Excuse me. You're able to scan your own organization, but let me go back to Robert's question specifically. So dynamic application scanning, and web application scanning, things of that nature, full pen testing. Risk Recon doesn't do pen testing, right? We're not in the pen testing world, and we still recommend having annual or twice a year pen testing done, and as part of that pen testing, looking at your web applications as well. And so that's a separate service, or you can work with a local reseller or whatever firm you work with to continue to do that. We are completely different from a vulnerability scanner. So when I think of Qualys or Tenable or Rapid7 or Nessus, I mean that's a full-on Vol scanner, and they're scanning internally. They're not doing anything externally. They couldn't do that. The EULA wouldn't let them do that. The moment that I start trying to kick your door down, Aaron, you're going to see that noise and you're going to blacklist me, and it's illegal for me to do that. So we're not able to do that. And so we still recommend, as a practice of what you asked earlier in the previous questions, how to minimize, or what are some of the best strategies to do that. A pen test is still recommended. It's still required. We are seeing organizations, I'm seeing some of my competitors trying to bring in a separate services arm where they can run those services for you separately. But by nature of the way that we scan and what we're doing, we're not going to be able to do a full-on web application pen test or whatnot. And we never claim to do that, right? That's still something that you're going to need to do separately, or as another kind of addition or part of what I talked about, security and layers, kind of in quotes, and kind of what you're going to want to look at. So great question, Robert. But unfortunately, like I said earlier, there's no unicorn yet. It's coming. We're all working towards, kind of making it more self-sufficient, and certainly it'll be a great addition, but we're just not there.
Yeah, I think the third-party risk management is a component of a more comprehensive cybersecurity strategy that you're probably going to have to piece together quite a few vendors to really have that comprehensive strategy. All right, so we did have a question from Christian. Would we be willing to exchange with European universities and research centers? And then he also asked, can we see examples of good systems that meet your standards so they know what they should aim for? And how is European GDPR affecting vendors in the USA? Is it hard to deal with, or don't you notice? I can talk about the GDPR thing if you want to talk about European research and examples of good systems.
Yeah, so a couple of things, right? I mean, I'll just make this simple. I know we're coming up on time, Aaron, but we offer a free trial on our website. So if you go to riskrecon.com, you can see that we offer free trials, and you can sign up for vendor scans. You can get up to 50 vendor scans. You can use academia as part of that, whatever you want, kind of take a look at it. So we are a global organization running on a global database from Mastercard. You could definitely take a look at those, and see what those scans look like. And if you're interested, reach out to me via email or schedule a call. I'll put you in contact with the right folks. But you can definitely see examples, and at no cost. Or run a trial, right? Like I said, and so that's something that we offer with no obligation, and no strong sales pitches, and we're not going to hound you down for every day or anything like that. But you're more than welcome to visit www.riskrecon.com, take a look at the trials, and take a look at that information is there, across the board. And then I'll hand it back to you for the GDPR. I know we're coming up on time, Aaron.
Yeah. No, GDPR is definitely affecting U.S. organizations that operate in Europe, and particularly the cross the ocean data sharing, because there was a privacy shield that was invalidated by the EU court, and so it basically said that U.S. companies operating in Europe have to maintain all of their systems in Europe, which from an engineering standpoint basically means you have to have a duplicate of your product in Europe. And so you have to maintain two different versions of your product, which is a nightmare. And I think the European Union wants to be able to allow compliant United States organizations to be able to uh, host Europeans' data in the United States. So there was a new one that came out that got approved by the EU, but it's got the same problem that the GDPR courts shot down with the Privacy Shield, which was that the letter of the law of GDPR says that you can't move stuff out, so they can't just pass a resolution saying that they're okay with it if they don't. They have to change the actual GDPR law in order to make this work. So right now it's kind of a gray area, and I think a lot of U.S. organizations are struggling to comply with GDPR. I think there's a fundamental different philosophy about privacy in the United States than Europe, and it's an ongoing compromise, I think, to meet in the middle there.
Yeah, I agree.
So,
I mean, I ran
yeah,
into it
go
quite a
ahead.
bit in Brazil. Brazilian GDPR, right? I covered Latin America for many years across the board, and so yeah, there's no easy answer for that. I think you were spot on, Aaron.
Yeah. Well, we're up against time. Thank you all for attending. We'll email you guys a link to this and also our contact information if you're interested in talking with me or Miguel about what our respective companies do with regards to reducing your company's third-party risk and reducing your digital footprint. Feel free to reach out to us, and hope you enjoy the rest of your week. And it was great to have you guys.
Thank you, Aaron. Thanks for having me.
Bye, everyone.
Take care. Have a great day. Be safe.